Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I see we already have really nice attendance and the number is going up quickly. So really appreciative of the interest in tonight's conversation. The purpose of this evening is to introduce to the community and ask questions from the community of the two finalists in the running for the position of Evanston City Manager. The council is really excited to introduce these two candidates to the community. And based on the feedback we've had so far, the community, while also very enthusiastic, has a ton of questions. So what we did for tonight is we put out an open call for questions. We got a really impressive response, both in just volume, but also in depth and nuance of the questions. And what I've done is out of those questions, in some instances copied and pasted directly, but more usually tried to amalgamate the most commonly asked about topics into a question that kind of hits the center of what was raised. At the end of the second of these two sessions, there will be a survey distributed, and I'll have more to say about that at the end of the second interview when we distribute that. But just as we were really very appreciative of the input that came from the community in designing the questions for tonight, we're very much hoping the community will be equally engaged in just sharing your thoughts and your reactions as council gets closer to the moment of making what I think is likely to be a difficult decision between two very impressive people. So the first candidate with us is Snapper Poche. We'll begin in a minute. We've got 45 minutes scheduled to do this. And the next interview begins at 7:30, so there's not going to be an aggressive hard stop of anyone being cut off in the middle of the sentence. But I think it's fair to predict that we have more questions than there are time. And so we'll kind of leave it to Snapper to strike that balance of how much depth to go into on each answer versus how short to keep things and make sure we have time for more questions. Rather than do the really awful thing of reading out loud somebody else's canned bio, I thought I would just begin in a very simple way, Snapper, and ask you to tell us about yourself and about your interest in Evanston.
Sure. First off, thank you all in attendance this evening for the opportunity to be considered for this position. It's really an honor for me. So I'm Snapper Poche. With a name like Snapper Poche, should acknowledge right at the gate, I'm not from the Midwest. I was born and raised in South Louisiana, and roundabout through a number of experiences, ended up in city government and realized that it's a passion for me, and it's an area of deep interest and something that I'm confident I'll continue with on through the remainder of my career. I come at this work having spent a number of years in City Hall in New Orleans, and then most recently running a couple of different contributing to programs on behalf of the Ash Center at Harvard University. And why Evanston? Evanston has so much, I think, to offer. I think it's a wonderful community, one that I've spent some time with. I went to the school just down the road in Chicago. This community strikes me as a wonderful quality of life, a very diverse community, which is important to my wife and I and our two small kids who would be moving there with us. I think it generally represents the shared values that we have shared, progressive values that I know, and I certainly have gotten the impression from my conversations with the council about what you all want to accomplish as a community, and it's very much aligned with the sort of place that I'd like to live. And I think one of the things that's really exciting to me about this opportunity is as I mentioned maybe in passing, but I've spent and I'm happy to go in more detail on these in future questions, but I've spent a lot of time working on government issues, and they range from the very real and not inconsequential issues of how to pick up trash and how to remove snow, and not to diminish that. But I think what's so intriguing about Evanston is while those undoubtedly exist in your community, it's also your willingness to take on these big, critical, sort of structural issues that I think more communities, frankly, ought to be grappling with issues around racial equity, reparations, structural racism, climate change, like these really meaty issues. And I think from my perspective, it's a very rich opportunity to contribute, to bring the skills that I can bring to bear to advance these these policy areas, and I'm excited about the opportunity.
Great, thank you very much. So let me move on to our first questions. And our first two questions actually are going to be on the same topic, which was by a wide margin, the topic most raised by folks who wrote in. And so the first one is this: how have you advanced equity in your current or previous positions? And please provide specific examples.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think this is such an important topic too. And I think, so I've done this in a couple, I've spent, as I mentioned, 5 years in the city of New Orleans, where this was certainly an issue, but I want to touch on a specific example that I have worked on more recently, where I was contributing to a program where I worked with, and I've had the opportunity as part of my current role to work with dozens of cities. This particular one, I was focusing on 10 cities across the state of New York, and how cities address distressed properties. And there's a great range in terms of what is defined as distressed property. So a distressed property in Rochester is different than one in Westchester County, just outside New York. But we, over the course of 2 years, worked with senior leaders throughout the housing department and housing sort of world within these cities to improve how they're addressing housing issues, how they're being more effective, how they're improving operational elements, and I think specifically equity considerations around the work that they do. And I think housing is a unique one because there's lots of ways by which a city can engage with a population around housing. And for example, in this case, it was code inspection. So in some ways, like a policing function, an enforcement function. And inspectors are really the sort of tip of the spear there. And so my team and I have been working for a long time with senior advisors within the cities to think about, how do you operationalize equity? What does that look like? And how does it look like in Rochester? How might that be different in Westchester, where it's not an issue of dilapidated properties, but more an issue of the importance of being able to get inside properties to inspect and make sure that really overpopulated, often overpopulated housing is still kept up to code and standards. And so, we spent a lot of time working with catered sort of solutions for each cities, but we're still struggling with this idea of like the real tip, the kind of tip of the spear, and where we think we can make the big difference was by engaging directly with inspectors. We had this wonderful plan. We got all the inspectors together, wanted to have a frank discussion around equity and what it looks like in your cities, in these respective cities. And frankly, it was a flop. And I acknowledge that full out to point to the fact that I think we all have so much to learn. I think what we did learn in the context of engaging with inspectors is that when you talk about equity, it requires a baseline of trust. It requires a baseline of shared understanding, and that's hard to do with such a diverse group, and it's like numerous levels of stakeholders. And I think so. We acknowledged that. Went back to leadership, had frank discussions with them, and over the course of that, the sort of follow-on from there is we learned some really key issues from the people who were leading these inspectional teams, which is that at the end of the day, and this was through a number of conversations, at the end of the day, one of the best things that we can do to advance an equity agenda is to make sure that inspectors, in this example, and this is getting long-winded, apologies if I'm going too deep here, but to have an effective inspectional staff, the best thing you can do is have an inspectional staff that is in of the communities in which they represent. In other words, like, this is not something that you can easily teach and train in a training, but it's deeper than that. It requires a profound understanding of the people in the population that you're serving.
Thank you very much. The next question is on a very related topic, but more of a forward-looking one than a backward-looking one. Many of the issues in Evanston relate to racial equity and institutional racism. How are you going to ensure that anti-racism and racial equity are core values implemented throughout all city services?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is similar to the last question that I answered, which is um, I think there's a couple of step process by which you do this effectively. First, it requires that all stakeholders and all functions of city government truly acknowledge that racism is an issue, that it exists. And I think it's easy and quick to say that at like an institutional level. Often it requires individual understanding. And so that acknowledgement might be different based upon different individuals. And frankly, like, you know, as a white male, having served in a majority Black city of New Orleans, like, you know, I had to have that own acknowledgement in my own, you know, myself and as my own journey as a city leader. And so baseline one is to sort of acknowledge that there's a problem. And I think you would do this in the context of operational departments and operational functions. So in the public works department, that acknowledgement will probably look quite different than it would in a police department or a code inspectional department. Then it's sort of it requires a clear understanding of the root causes of why it exists in the first place, and more critically, how it manifests itself in practical areas in the domain which you're looking at and working toward. And so, you know, doing a sort of comprehensive inventory of what that looks like and how for example, are inequities manifest in a code operation. I think it also requires a very clear shift in, and this gets back to the acknowledgement problem, but an empathy and an understanding at an individual level of why this is important. And I think this is really critical to be successful at an institutional level. And then, you know, upon sort of that acknowledgement and recognition of a need for change, then you start to do the much more meaningful work of what does a strategy look like? How do you lead more equitable practices? How do you operationalize those? And then, you know, ultimately, I think this represents a shift in resources, right? And so there's inherently a sacrifice that's to be associated with that across operational domains.
Thanks very much. Next, switching gears somewhat, Evanston has pretty high property taxes. We have bold ambitions that will cost money to achieve, and we have a history of budget challenges. So given these constraints, what would be your approach to the budget?
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you for it. I think it really boils down to focusing on outcomes. And I think oftentimes cities, to their own detriment, spend a lot of time focusing on budget and numbers. And we do not do enough about talking about what the investment of these budget dollars actually mean in real services and delivery to residents. So, you know, have a frank discussion about what the budget accomplishes. Shift the discussion from dollars to values and investments in those values. I think there are a number of ways that you can do this in a very concrete way to advance this. First is a performance-based budgeting system. So this is something that's very important to me that I feel like has been very successful in other cities is how many widgets do you get when you make certain investments and budget allocations? What does that look like? You know, is that the right allocation of resources relative to the values that, you know, we hear from residents, that you would hear from residents? Similarly, I think not just a performance-based budget, but a performance management regime broadly, I think is really important to doing this, right? To demonstrate the relative return on investment and the productivity and the essentially inject accountability into the services of government. Oftentimes, you know, even if a layperson wanted to dig into a city budget, it is often at the departmental level, and it may include FTE, but it doesn't really include much information in terms of the performance for those individual departments, what that looks like, why those investments are worthwhile. The other piece that I would say is the importance of, two more things I would add. One would be just, I would acknowledge the importance of transparency, and generally governments, and I would think Evanston, and I would certainly want to push this agenda if I were chosen as a city manager, is being as transparent as possible about all that data, all the performance management details that I mentioned before about how do you measure outcomes for individual departments? How do we measure the number of potholes filled, et cetera? And then the final thing is just the importance. And it's kind of hard to overstate this, I think, is the importance for community engagement to help prioritize. So, I spoke a little bit about values and the importance of a values-driven budget. We have to engage. The city has to engage in residents to understand what those values are, and they have to bring that engagement to residents where they are. Right? I think this is more than just a sort of once a year budget meeting where folks can come in, but really meaningfully engaging them.
Great, thank you. Next, what steps will you take to implement Evanston's climate action and resilience plan?
Thank you. So first off, let me acknowledge that I think many kudos to the plan, to having a plan, and to really taking a bold agenda and a bold you're setting very bold goals for what you hope to accomplish. I think it's very impressive. I would say I'd break that down into 2 points. One is sort of partitioning the municipal operations element of this, and I think this is a fairly straightforward one, which is within municipal operations, this is the domain that the city manager of the government directly controls. It's making this a priority, embedding the broader decision-making framework into the budget. So when I mentioned about performance-based budgets, but very similarly, and I think quite frankly easily, you can engage this sort of the relative climate costs and climate impact of those investments within the budget. It's part of a broader performance management regime, and I think also would be an important consideration in contracting procurement, right? So when thinking through the budget, the municipal government's sort of actions that you take, that we would all take, this should be a front and center consideration in making those decisions and informing those decisions. So I think that part is actually fairly straightforward. I think the non-municipal operations is a little bit more interesting, right? Which is, and to be clear, this represents probably, as I recall, like 98% of the overall emissions in Evanston. And in my review, it had questions around the emission sources and who's accounting for those emissions, what that looks like. I was really impressed by the commitment from the anchor institutions of Northwestern and the hospital, but it wasn't clear what those commitments to reductions actually mean in the context of, for example, climate reduction, greenhouse gas reductions. And so, be very concrete about how that pie slice should be divvied up. I actually have, prior to working in cities, I spent some time in the federal government. In fact, helped to co-author and implement one of the executive orders when the Obama White House that really drove federal agencies to account all their greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is something that's really close to my heart. I also happen to know that buildings are almost certainly the biggest emission source. And I imagine, having been just a smidgen of time in Evanston, but I imagine that most of those are residential housing units. And so, when you start to break down these broad goals, I wonder if folks who own these properties know their relative potential contribution to these goals. So I think there's a big opportunity to engage meaningfully with community, make much more explicit who's on tap for contributing to the goals and the greenhouse gas reductions associated with different sectors and elements of a community. And then finally, I would say there is an opportunity for the city to sort of lean into programs, sort of subsidies, incentives to encourage investments in the type of things that make sense. So in the built environment, for example, reviewing building codes to make sure that that the very high standards, for example, for insulation, which generally has a very high cost return, is aligned with those goals too. So again, sorry, long answer, but.
Thank you very much. And just for the record, we're doing fine on time. So
okay, good. Maybe I'm just talking fast because I'm worried I'm not getting enough in here.
So the next question is the following: the transition to online retail, followed by a pandemic, have been very hard for our local small businesses. What would be your strategy to attract and retain small businesses and to make our business districts vibrant and attractive?
Yeah, thank you for this question as well. So I think the pandemic, first of all, it's acknowledged that the pandemic changed a lot, and the landscape is changing in Evanston and all over the world, frankly. As an anecdote, and I'm sure this is something that many of the listeners can relate to, you know, my wife, who worked for a large company, they are now 100% remote. They used to occupy a giant building in Washington, D.C., and now that building will sit vacant and otherwise be at a good use. You presumably arrive at another alternative use. But I think first is just the acknowledgement that the Earth in some ways may have shifted, but I think that does not preclude really unique and meaningful opportunities to create new spaces to serve potentially the new needs that exist. I think how do you do that is first, you know, have a sound understanding of the market that exists today. So understand the drivers, have a robust economic development team that really make sure that small businesses and these sort of businesses that exist in the downtown corridors, that they are experiencing the conditions that they need. I think there's great opportunities to leverage funding for federal, state, and local funds around potential investments. And then, you know, as part of that, I think what you'll find, what I suspect you would find, and is this sort of that much more granular data and a clear understanding of what the marketplace, how that shift looks like, right? So the former restaurant may be a co-working space that is equally vital to the community and a interesting place to be and coexist, but you know, but that would ultimately represent a shift in how the property is being used. The final thing I would say on this is just I think the importance of kind of place-based investments and the city's role in doing that. And so that's a bit jargony, but what that really means is acknowledging that the city has great authority to invest in places across the services that they provide to create conditions for a great life. So that means really focused and targeted public works investments, the focused investments in, for example, trash can receptacles and parks, bike and transportation infrastructure. So an example of this is one that I worked on very closely in New Orleans, and admittedly, this is a post-Katrina environment. I spent a number of years there working specifically on the reinvestment and sort of revitalization of a very important commercial corridor. I was in a really critically important neighborhood within the city, but that had been distressed before the storm. And you know, I, on behalf of the code enforcement where I worked, as well as the redevelopment authority, as well as the public works, as well as the Parks and Parkways division, very strategically invested in all elements of government service to create a place that was attractive broadly to businesses as well as residents in the nearby neighborhood. And I think directly because of that investment, because of the streetscape investments, because of the new trees and landscapes, like it became a place and a real destination for residents. And it's now a very vital commercial corridor within a neighborhood that didn't really even exist to the extent that it does now prior to the levee bridge.
Thank you very much. Next, affordable housing is a key priority for the city. How would you assess, integrate, and plan around affordable housing to ensure that we have tangible goals, accountability, and deadlines for action?
Okay, thank you for that question as well. I think initially there should be a broad affordable housing. I think this is something that you could study comprehensively to understand the marketplace, and then ultimately create a very focused plan that addresses those needs. And I acknowledge right out the gate that that's speaking very much in generalizations, because I think what you'll find in the very comprehensive study that would result, that I have in mind and that I'm suggesting here, is some some unique segmentations and some very specific sort of policy levers and investments that make sense. Let me just step back a little bit and say I'll offer some thoughts around affordable housing. The federal government provides a number of funds through the Fed and states, most of it through HUD, home funds, CDBGs, et cetera. I think every city manager, every candidate for city manager, every elected official is going to say, and they're going to gladly and appropriately talk about how the impact of these investments, how important they are, and I would agree with that completely. It's frankly, there's never enough subsidy relative to the need, and I'm certain that's the case in Evanston. And so I think the real focus and the real opportunity for places like Evanston is to identify the conditions under which the naturally occurring affordable housing already exist and invest significantly in making that sector as viable and growth ready as possible. And so what is that like, just to provide a bit more context around this sort of naturally occurable affordable housing? It almost definitely is not large housing developments, right? If you think about any community, and I'm sure this is the case in Evanston, if the large scale developments with lots of units, unless they're explicitly required to by zoning, and we can talk about that, or unless there's direct subsidy, they're often too costly. Not always, and there's a bunch of caveats here. I fully acknowledge that. But the naturally occurring stuff is almost always done by sort of small scale, mom and pop family housing groups who are buying onesies and twosies or buying multi units, keeping it in the family. And I think this is so critical when you acknowledge that like there's never going to be enough resources to subsidize our way out of this. I think similarly, and I touched on this before, is I think the critical opportunity for potential zoning changes to be to sort of encourage this sort of investment. Zoning is a discussion and in many ways a lightning rod for lots of communities. You know, I've spoke about this at the council already, the importance I think in zoning, but also the acknowledgement that it really needs to align very tightly with community values. And you know, I think it's a question for Evanston is how much they want to lean into the opportunities that exist, very real opportunities around Evanston, around zoning that would include, for example, accessory dwelling units or inclusionary zoning. You know, there's also potential for fees reduction, permitting reviews, et cetera. I think there's lots of levers to pull. I think to get a real sound understanding of this is to do a comprehensive study of the housing needs, the housing that exists, and then sort of be very, very specific and targeted in terms of where those investments make the most sense given those needs.
Thank you. Now, and I just want to acknowledge that this is a dramatic change in topic and tone, but that's what happens when you have a very diverse set of questions that come in. But you've probably read about the terrible misconduct that occurred among lakefront employees in recent years, as well as the report that included significant recommendations about next steps. What will be your strategy to implement these recommendations and prevent similar behaviors from occurring in the future?
Yeah, I appreciate the question very much. I think this really most fundamentally is focused on culture and a culture of ensuring accountability and really around values and acknowledgement and in frank discussions around how the workplace should exist, how as an organization should treat and respect employees, and what that means in practice. I think in terms of implementation of the recommendations, I think it's a laundry list that is comprehensive, you know, that is appropriate to follow. I think the explicitly making milestones. I would encourage accountability in this, and I think more broadly in terms of the question around preventing it from happening again is to do a complete inventory of all city functions and all city departments to really understand the conditions under which this occurred and ensuring that they no longer exist and that everyone has a very clear understanding for um, the appropriate um, the appropriate way to treat employees, the appropriate way to address underlying issues that may come up, and also the accountability that will be accompanying that.
Thank you. And changing gears again, what is the role of long-range land use and transportation planning? How do you make a plan? And how do you ensure that the community and city government are bought in so that they stick with the plan?
Yeah, so I love this question. I think I'm going to flip the answer relative to the question. So it's how do you make the community abide by the plan? Is that the community needs to own the plan. It needs to be a key part in defining the plan and ultimately executing the plan, and that needs to be sort of bought in. So, so how do you then make the plan a long-term sort of strategic plan for a city? It acknowledges that 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 um, that that at the most fundamental level, this like I and nor any city administrator should be in charge of sort of what Evanston and what your collective view, those of you listening in and the residents, what their collective view of the city should be moving forward. And so when you define that plan and how I would define that plan and how I would go about updating the plan when it, if I were chosen and if this were my responsibility, is to first acknowledge that like to do this, and it's typically done once every 10 to 20 years, is a big effort, and it's probably something that the city's not going to do alone. So engage in a third party vendor that's going to help with this, that has the bona fides and the demonstrated capacity to meaningfully engage with residents and around issues that are really important to them. And I spoke a little bit earlier about the importance of engagement. I think it's like, again, I think it's kind of hard to overstate meaningful engagement to residents and to do that well, and to acknowledge that people are busy. Folks have got jobs and responsibilities and kids, and they cannot go to a meeting at 7 o'clock where they sit around a table with a charrette, right? And so bringing that engagement directly to residents in places where they are, having frank discussions about values, and making sure that the ultimate sort of plan around what land use looks like is rooted in what you heard in that engagement, and that when it comes out, and if you're successful at this, this should be a straightforward proposition, but that when the plan comes out, the people feel as though they own it. People feel as though they had a voice in creating it, and that they have a stake in the plan moving forward. And then the sort of first part of this question, which is how do you successfully implement it, is much, much easier. Frankly, I would almost argue it's impossible to get it right without doing it that way, or really difficult.
Thank you. Let me just a quick follow-up on the first part of the question. What is the role of these plans? What is, we're all familiar with the notion of spending a lot of time doing plans, and then plans sit on a shelf and don't really matter very much. There's a widespread view that land use is different. You can't afford to do that. Why? What is the benefit to a city of doing long-range land use planning properly?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think one is it acknowledges that investments in land and changes in land last a long time, right? And so you want to be very diligent and careful about how these decisions are made. I think the other piece of this is to acknowledge that land use and an individual land use there are other folks at stake in how land is used than perhaps just the owner of that land. And so it's also a really important tool to govern the appropriate use of land such that it is aligned with the broader expectations that I talked about before. And in terms of in the context of a zoning plan. I mean, we can talk broadly about plans and climate plans, but I think how it's used is it's certainly not a plan that sits on a shelf, and that it fundamentally creates maps, a series of maps with very concrete overlays, with very clear directions in terms of what the community thinks is reflective of its values and what is not, and sort of would help to govern those decisions moving forward.
Thank you. Next question, what is your view on a city government's involvement with local workforce development activity?
Yeah, this is maybe can you define what like workforce development, just in the context of this question? I know broadly what it is, but is there any more detail?
Well, there isn't, and it's not my question, but I'll do my best. I'll do my best.
I know you wordsmith some of these, so I thought you might have some intel.
You know, I think there are gaps that exist between the public school system and the private employer market. And we have some nonprofits, some cherished nonprofits that play a critical role in filling that gap. But there's also the view among some that the city could take a variety of different types of steps to fill that gap, to address workforce needs, to address the needs of individuals, particularly youth, who are disconnected from the labor market, and to address the needs of employers who are in the process of seeking out workers. And so the question is, what's the city's role in that? And how do you, whatever you think the city's role is, how do you then best actually do it?
Sure, I really appreciate the context. It's quite helpful. So first, though, like, let's be frank, is it in the city's interest to have a workforce and to have a clear pathways and a number of pathways for residents to move beyond high school through trade school or college? Absolutely. And I think it's critical to have multiple different types of workforces to meet the diverse sectors that I know exist in Evanston. I'm encouraged to hear that already there are nonprofits and efforts going into this place. I think that makes complete sense. In terms of the city's role there, I think that's frankly a discussion that I would be eager to have with residents and the council about what that might look like. I mean, I know a number of cities that I've worked with directly have really leaned in, and I think there's some really nice models to either directly invest or help facilitate. I'm less familiar with cities where the cities are actually implementing programs, but all options are on the table. I think this goes back to sort of the question around budgeting, and I think there was maybe the second or third one of the questions you asked early on around acknowledging the relatively high tax base and the bold things that the city wants to do. It's sort of, does this float to the top given very real budget constraints? And I think there's a very strong argument to suggest that it is in Evanston and all communities' best interest to have an eye toward keen understanding for workforce development issues, where investments might need to be made, and ensure that residents have opportunities for employment and clear pathways to employment and advancement. But that's a values-based discussion that I would love to engage with should I have the chance.
Thank you. As the Evanston City Manager who is accountable to the City Council and Mayor, how would you lead and model inclusion, equity, wisdom, and compassion with both your employees and the broader community?
Yeah, I mean, I would do that in some ways related to the sort of, I kind of laid out a approach around acknowledging that inequities exist and building upon the opportunities for empathy and thinking strategically. I think that, I think you should expect me, and I will commit to living that out in my day-to-day life and be quite intentional about what those engagements look like. I think on the community side, it's like what that means in a practical matter is I think if I were to be City Hall, I would be around the, excuse me, if I would be city manager, I would be around City Hall. I would be engaging with people, and I would be living out my own values as they relate to equity. And I would hope, geez, I would hope that people would hold me to account to that. And if they find that I'm not, I also hope they would call me on it in a very explicit way. And I would engage, I would love to engage in that. I think the second part of that is a bit more, it's less intuitive, or it would take a bit more leaning in, which is to be present, right? The way that you demonstrate equity in city government is to show up in neighborhoods that have historically been treated unequal, and to clearly demonstrate the sort of values that we've talked about already, right? And make sure that the city is operating in a way that is advances your equity goal. So like a nice example of this is, you know, the mayor of LaGuardia, the former mayor of New York, used to say, "There's no Democratic or Republican way to pick up trash," right? And that's sort of true, except there kind of is, because we now know from lots of data that certain neighborhoods have much better and cleaner and faster trash collection than others. And so this is like a direct manifestation of these values of like, what does equity look like in the public space? Well, this is it. And this is, how do we show up, right? And this is beyond just me showing up at a meeting, but like, how does the city show up to solve people's problems and lean into the inequities that exist and do it in a very diligent and sort of intentional way.
Thank you. Please describe operational skills you've learned in any of your previous roles that would be applied if you were selected to run our city.
Sure, thank you for the question. I spent, and I've glossed over this in my intro, I spent 5 years in the city of New Orleans, where I was hired as a contributor to the Office of Performance and Accountability, which is, you know, I spent some time early on talking about performance management, the importance of performance budgeting. I think all that is true and critical. I also ran a program that was specifically focused on blight, and it was called the Blight Stat program. Just for context, post-Katrina New Orleans, this was like 10 years after the storm, blight and distressed properties were still, and were one of the most kind of poignant, salient issues. And so I kind of helped to lead the effort that was the city and residents sort of vehicle to evaluate whether the city was effectively reducing blight, how they were prioritizing. We were very transparent about this throughout. So what this meant in practice was there was like a monthly meeting where the public was invited. We reviewed all the operational data for the code enforcement and all the other departments that were linked to reducing blight in cities. Excuse me, in the city of New Orleans. What I found through that was that solving distressed properties in New Orleans, I'm convinced, and was one of the most complex things that cities do, because it requires a whole bunch of like cross silo things that traditionally cities haven't been really good at. Which is, it's like the basic assumption is that you send an inspector out, he finds some stuff, and then he goes and writes a report, which is true, except then what do you do with that report? And then what does the city do to actually compel someone to get their blighted and distressed property in order? And in the context of that, I dove really deep on blight and then distressed properties and the city's response to distressed properties. And then kind of accidentally ended up leading the department that ran those. And what I learned was the innumerable aspects of really digging into the operations. So like very concrete techniques like understanding fish bones and process mapping, and thinking about how do we allocate resources, thinking about issues like not just efficiency, which seems to be the buzzword that you hear from lots of folks, but the overall effectiveness of government. So acknowledging it's not necessarily how fast we do it, but are we doing the right property? In a city like New Orleans, where there were literally tens of thousands of distressed properties, it was really important that we get the right one, not that we just pick one. Looking at inventive and sort of creative ways to encourage people and property owners to fix their property and invest in their property in a way that wasn't punitive, but that was much more sort of encouraging. So for example, we, through this process mapping, operational evaluations, sort of right-sizing the organization, we happened upon this opportunity to send folks letters to say, hey, an inspector's coming out to your house next week. We just want to let you know you may want to take a look at it. And oh, by the way, in the back of the letter, here's some common things that we may find. And we found that you can expect after sending that letter, like a 13% reduction in the findings of distress of a violation in the property simply by sending a letter. And all of that was, this is a long explanation for me to say, all of that was really rooted in a sound understanding of the operations and the kind of techniques that I think I would bring and would love to bring to bear to Evanston in the context of improving how the city addresses fundamental problems for residents.
Thanks very much. So we're at time, but I just want to give you a quick opportunity if you want to either make any closing comments or add anything you didn't have a chance to mention. Please go ahead, and again, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. I guess I would say I'm really excited about this, the chance to contribute to what I think is a unique community with the willingness to do really bold things. And I think I would bring skills that are especially appropriate for that. I've led meaningful change across sort of city operations within the city of New Orleans and dozens of other cities that I've dealt with in my current role. I have experience with cities around the world to really have a sound understanding of kind of what works, why it works, how it works, and what may not work in all cases. What you're gonna get with me as a potential city manager is someone who's deeply committed to the values that I believe you share as well around equity, around effective and efficient government. Someone who's going to demand and consistently use data to drive insights. Someone who's comfortable and willing to innovate and take risks and try new things. Someone who will come with a very strong work ethic, with an empathy and a sound and an approach that's really focused on seeking to understand before fixing. And then one that is deeply committed to engaging with residents, and I think that's a kind of a critical part of this role. So thank you for considering me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time this evening, and thanks so much for your answers, which I think were extremely helpful. What I'm going to do now is, first of all, you're excused, and thanks so much for giving us a part of your evening. I'll just switch off my camera and give the audience I guess about roughly a 12-minute break, and we'll be back at 7:30 with the other candidate for city manager. So thanks to the terrific number of community participants who are giving their evening to be a part of this important process. And thank you very much, Snapper, for your time and your answers.
Thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Good evening.
Good evening. How are you, Mr. Mayor?
Just fine. How are you, John?
Wonderful.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Just a few items of housekeeping. First of all, I want to apologize to the city of Evanston. Your mayor has not become a zombie. I'm just having a lighting issue here, so that's how it's going to be, I'm afraid. Just for your information, John, we've got a really wonderful turnout, well over 100 residents. The other candidate for the position just participated in a analogous discussion that began an hour ago, ran about 45 minutes. We'll be asking you the same questions. These are questions that were sourced from the public. So we gave the public the opportunity to reach out and share their questions. And from that, I collated what you'll be asked tonight, which really essentially goes from the questions that were asked about the very most and then and then down the list for as long as we have time. So thank you for your participation in this and your interest in the city. And as I said before, the previous candidate, the council is really excited about the two candidates that we're introducing to the community and very appreciative of your interest and looking forward to this conversation. So I'll begin, I won't begin by staring down at a sheet of paper and reading a stilted bio of you and hoping that I get the punctuation right. I just want to ask you a simple question. Tell us about yourself and about your interest in Evanston.
Sure. Well, my name is John Fournier. I'm currently the Assistant City Administrator for the City of Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was born and raised in Michigan. I'm a graduate of Michigan State University, and I have made my career in public service, working in and around communities and for cities. After my now wife and I graduated, we kind of hit the road and worked all over the country. Lived in Austin, Texas for a while, lived in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, lived overseas even, but spent most of our time in Pittsburgh, where I worked in city government there, most notably as the Deputy Chief of Staff to Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto. And for the last 4 years, I've been in the city of Ann Arbor, doing what I can for my home state and really enjoying being home and being in Michigan. But Evanston really is a really great community and a really unique opportunity. Everybody wants to work in an environment where they're supported and where they can contribute. And when I first learned of the opportunity in Evanston, I started reading about the city and learning about the issues that are in front of you. And issues about climate change are really important to me and have been really important in my career. I have a lot of experience dealing with budget issues in local government, and I think that I can be really productive and really helpful for the city of Evanston. I have experience in human resources management, and I think that's a need in the city right now. And so when I think about the really critical issues that are in front of Evanston right now, I think, I'm somebody who can come and contribute and really help. And that really excites me. So, and to boot, Evanston is just a fantastic community. I love that it's on the lake. My wife is from Traverse City, Michigan. And so we are definitely Lake Michigan people. And having spent some time in Evanston, I love the city. And so it's the type of walkable community that I really enjoy and really, have spent my career helping to support and helping to build. So all of those things together really make this a really unique and really interesting opportunity.
Thank you very much. So the first two questions actually will be in the same broad topic, which was the topic that by far had the largest number of questions that were submitted. So first of all, how have you advanced equity in your current or previous positions? And please provide specific examples.
Sure. Great question. Thank you for it. And I'm glad that that's our first question too. First, I want to talk a little bit about what equity actually is. Equity is really about ensuring that people have an equal ability to participate or to receive services. And that's really different from an equal opportunity. And I think it's important to make that distinction. It's oftentimes talked about in the context of diversity and inclusion too, right? Your DEI efforts and DEI programs. Diversity, of course, being about making sure that you have people of difference in and around your organization. and inclusion is about creating a culture that specifically invites people who've traditionally been excluded to participate, and creates a culture where they feel comfortable participating. But when you're thinking about equity, you should be thinking about all of your DE and I. And when you're going through your diversity, equity, and inclusion planning, you should also be creating something called an equity lens. And an equity lens is really a statement of values about what the organization values about equity and diversity and inclusion. And it's usually also a series of questions that you use to kind of test your programs and your policies and make sure that they're up to snuff and meeting the values that you have for your organization. So these questions might be things like, how are we accommodating non-English speakers? How might those involved in leadership in this program be leaning on their biases, right? Or how has this process supported or excluded people from traditionally or historically marginalized groups or communities? And so, I would really, I think it's really important for organizations to develop a good equity lens and apply that to their programs across the board. And that's something that I've done in my career. So I'll go back and talk a little bit about my work in Pittsburgh. When I started in the mayor's office, I was integral in creating a bureau called the Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment. And that bureau really focused on core issues in the community, like educational outcomes and housing security and homelessness and all kinds of issues, where we specifically programmed government resources at confronting traditional inequities in the city of Pittsburgh and centering those things in our discussions in the mayor's office so that we could really make progress on important issues. We also worked on something I worked on in city council, is a program called the Neighborhood First Capital Budget Reform Act, which was really about, looking at the city's history of capital investments and finding out where those investments have historically been made and where we have some room to make up and where we need to be, making future investments in a bigger way. And so, we really changed the process of capital budgeting in the city of Pittsburgh. And tried to institute rules and guidelines to make sure our capital dollars are invested equitably across the city. In the city of Ann Arbor, I was integral in putting the city's first diversity, equity, and inclusion plan together. And that has resulted in some important structural changes in city government. I put together a proposal for us hiring a new chief equity officer and a DEI coordinator. And those positions are being hired now. The purpose of those positions isn't to be people who make an equity lens or make a DEI plan and then let it sit on the shelf. The purpose of operations like that is to have those individuals work intentionally with your department directors, and your unit managers, and your supervisors to draft DEI plans and to use the equity lens within their own operations and empower them to be the champions within their own departments and their own units for the kind of changes you want to see with those plans. I've worked on redrafting a slew of city policies in Ann Arbor. Our employee standards of conduct policy really needed to be updated through our equity lens. Conflict of interest policy. We instituted a really progressive parental leave policy. I was looking at our funeral leave policy at one point, and I said, man, the definition of family that's included in our funeral leave policy is incredibly outdated. And so, we took the time to update that policy so it was way more inclusive and way more equitable for the city. Just a couple more examples. Just this last summer, I was the acting city administrator for the city of Ann Arbor over the summer. And one of the first things I did was direct an analysis of pay equity for our non-union employees. We knew we had pay equity problems in the city, and we needed to recognize them and quantify them. And so we did this study, and I directed $200,000 in pay adjustments across the organization to make sure that people were being paid equitably in the city. And so, these may seem like a bunch of smaller initiatives that get accumulated together, But the reality is that there is no silver bullet to tackling equity within your organization. What it really gets done by going through department by department and program by program, making sure that you've got quality leadership on the issue, you've got a really effective equity lens, and evaluating everything from top to bottom to make sure that your programs and your policies are as equitable as possible. And it's a process that, you know, you're never really done with. It's a garden that needs constant tending. And so those are just some examples of equity initiatives that I've led in my career.
Thank you. So staying in that same area, but looking away from the past and toward the future, many of the issues in Evanston relate to racial equity and institutional racism. How are you going to ensure that anti-racism and racial equity are core values implemented throughout all city services?
Right. So I'm going to lean on the parts of the answer that I just gave, is that it's about operationalizing your equity lens. You know, equity generally is about, identifying broad, broad communities and broad groups of people who've traditionally been excluded from opportunities. Racial equity is a specific type of equity, right? That is really, really important, especially in the United States, especially in communities like Ann Arbor and Pittsburgh and Evanston. And so, when you talk specifically about racial equity, I'm going to lean back on talking about the history of capital investments in your city, making sure that capital investments are being made equitably. I'm going to talk about the really important legacy of redlining and housing development, and the effects that has on economic opportunities, not just in your main streets and in your business districts, but for families also, and recognizing the work that you have to do to make up those differences. For 2 years, I was the interim human resources director for the city of Ann Arbor, and we made a lot of really important changes while I was there in terms of hiring, right? What I wanted to do was look at our hiring practices through an equity lens and understand who are we making finalists for positions and interviewing, and what is the demographic spread there? Who are we hiring, and what is the demographic spread there? And what do we need to do to improve those figures to make sure that we are making an honest effort at overcoming racial biases in the hiring process? And so, I was really proud of that work in the city, and it's work that I, love to continue in the city of Evanston. And so, in the city of Pittsburgh, I worked on things like Ban the Box. In both Pittsburgh and Ann Arbor, we made real changes to our drug screening policy to make sure that we weren't, filtering out really qualified candidates. I've talked about our family leave policy and important changes I made to parental leave policies as well. And so, those are things that, again, I'll just go back and lean on the idea that making progress on these issues is about identifying your equity lens, really intentionally leading in your DEI programs and going through program to program to program and department and department and department, and making sure that you are applying that equity lens aggressively and updating policies and practices on a regular basis.
Thank you very much. The next question is as follows. Evanston has pretty high property taxes. We have bold ambitions that will cost money to achieve, and we have a history of budget challenges. Given all these constraints, what would be your approach to the budget?
Sure. Sounds a lot like my time in Pittsburgh and in Ann Arbor. It's, budget challenges are not unique for local governments. I think the specific details of them vary from community to community. But the truth is that most local governments in the United States have budget issues and require creative problem solving to tackle them. I'll talk a little bit about my experience in Pittsburgh. When I worked in the mayor's office as the deputy chief of staff, I will never forget, just a few weeks into the mayor's term after he was sworn in, we discovered that there was a $23 million structural deficit in the budget that hadn't been disclosed publicly until that point. And, Pittsburgh is a strong mayor form of government. And when new mayors come into office, department directors are oftentimes replaced in batch. And so at that point in time, we didn't have a finance director. The city didn't have an office of management and budget. That was something that we created during my time in Mayor Peduto's administration. And so on discovering this deficit, the mayor and the chief of staff said, John, you're running point on this. We need a plan. The budget is due to our state overseers in April or May, and we have a budget due to City Council in September. And so I worked with the staff we had, pulled a team together, and put a plan together that solved that $23 million budget deficit. And what I didn't mention was that at the time, the city was under Act 47 financial oversight, which is a form of receivership, essentially. It's one step before receivership in the state of Pennsylvania. And so our budgets were all reviewed by state overseers before they could be presented to City Council. And that year, the city had to create a new 5-year plan for Act 47. And so one of my charges wasn't just helping to put this budget proposal together, but in writing a new Act 47 plan. And so we did that, got it all put together and sent to our state overseers. And that plan was so successful that the state released the city of Pittsburgh from financial oversight 2 years earlier than it should have been. And so, you know, I kind of set the table for this conversation to talk about my experience in budgeting. You know, we have similar issues in Ann Arbor as well. The way that the state law works in Ann Arbor, we actually are most years forced to cut our property tax rate every year, which makes our budgets really, really tight. And so we've had to get really creative in the city of Ann Arbor to keep our budget moving forward and kind of pull it out of a structural deficit. But let me talk a little bit specifically about Evanston. I've read through your CAFR, I've read through your budget documents. Obviously, there's a lot more to learn, and I hope I get the opportunity to do that. But right off the bat, some things come to mind for me. First, I would look at right sizing the city's assets, you know, talking about properties that it owns, facilities that it owns, the vehicle fleet, equipment, things like that, to make sure that the city is not over investing for its needs. And that's a, I think, specifically salient strategy right now as we're dealing with teleworking during the pandemic. You know, in the city of Ann Arbor, I was instrumental in writing the city's teleworking policy. And what that means is most of our employees who aren't, you know, public works laborers, police or fire can work outside of the office a couple of days a week. And so our city hall on good days is 50 to 60% empty. And so as we kind of engage more in teleworking, I think organizations are coming to terms with the fact that it works, that especially municipal governments can continue to deliver excellent services without having, you know, all of their employees working full time in the office all the time. And that really changes your facility needs in a big, big way. And so there are opportunities there. I'd look at revenue generating assets to see if there are additional revenue opportunities. So, you know, the parking system, the parks system, city facilities, market-based revenue opportunities, which are essentially advertising opportunities on city facilities. And so I want to say that doesn't just mean increasing fees or increasing parking rates. It means getting creative with how you're using those assets. So for instance, in the park system, you might be able to provide, you know, higher level services for a fee. Or one thing I noticed about Evanston and the parking system is that you're enforcing time limits at the meters through ticketing. It's a 2-hour time limit. If you stay over, you get a ticket. Well, an alternative approach to that might be saying you can stay over 2 hours, but your hourly parking meter rate is going to increase substantially after that point. That can save you resources on the enforcement side and also provide a revenue opportunity for you on the revenue side without having to increase that top line meter rate when people first pull up to the meter and want to take advantage of your business districts. I think it's also important to aggressively pursue federal and state funding opportunities. I saw Evanston recently hired a state lobbyist, and I think that's really, really important. But federal lobbyists oftentimes also are really important for revenue opportunities, and the return on investment from your federal lobbyists is oftentimes much greater than it is for state lobbyists, because you get greater opportunities for things like federal earmarks or federal granting opportunities. And I think it's important to have a grant writing staff as well. That's something that we did in the city of Pittsburgh. We hired professional grant writers to help us bring in money from the foundation community, and it was really effective. Our return on investment was substantial, much more than the cost of the personnel. So I think those are things on the revenue side that the city should be considering. On the expenditure side, I'm a really big fan of managing through technology. In the city of Pittsburgh, I worked diligently to use technology to virtualize a number of our permits, to automate some of our enforcement activities at the parking authority, to automate a lot of processes in City Hall. And so what that allows you to do, you're not looking for opportunities to lay employees off, and I'll get more into that in a second, but you are looking for opportunities to kind of bend the cost curve on the growth of your employee base over time. And managing through technology can allow you to do that. I think it's important also for the city to explore becoming self-insured for its healthcare costs. I don't think Evanston is self-insured at the moment. That's something that we implemented in Pittsburgh, and we were able to experience a lot of savings on the healthcare side. And it's something that we do in Ann Arbor, and it's been really important for us to maintaining balance in our budget. And I also would want to have a look at how the city's using its ARPA funds. There are investments that can be made that meet urgent community needs, that also meet the federal rules for the ARPA funds, but that can also help bend the cost curve long-term on city expenditures. And a great example of that is that the federal rules allow you to, invest in your water facilities to make them more energy efficient, or to install solar panels on city facilities or on city assets. And those are things that aren't just really important for the city's climate action goals and for the environment, but those can help control energy costs in the future. So anyway, these are a lot of individual and specific ideas about what can happen with the budget. But my experience is that budgets become balanced by becoming familiar with the details on a department by department level, and making a lot of really important decisions all together at the same time that help you control costs and maximize revenues. And that's kind of how you bring those cost curves together over time. And the last thing I'll say, I said I wanted to touch on, using layoffs and pay freezes and things like that. Your budget is a framework for managing a successful organization. And, this is city government. This is mission-driven work. We're not running a Walmart here, right? We're trying to manage really important community assets and community services. And to do that, you need employees who are supported and who are motivated and who show up to work every day really believing in the public service mission that they have. And so when you're in a tough budget position, layoffs and pay freezes are your absolute last resort. And I believe that strongly, because, it is once you kind of lose that trust with your employees that you're going to support them and invest in them and help them succeed. Once you lose that trust, it takes years to earn it back. And it can have really devastating impacts on your organization. And so, my philosophy when it comes to managing budgets is you have to prioritize your dollars towards what the council's priorities are. In Ann Arbor, we have a priority-based budgeting framework. I think it can be valuable to have a priority-based budgeting framework. It's something that we've implemented within the last 4 years, so I have experience implementing those types of budgets. But you always want to make sure that you're investing your dollars toward the city's priorities and with the organization's help first and foremost on your mind. And that means supporting and empowering people to meet city council's priorities.
Thanks very much. The next question is, what steps will you take to implement Evanston's climate action and resilience plan?
Sure. So I was really excited to read Evanston's Climate Action and Resilience Plan, because it's really ambitious and it's really well done. And I think that the community and the city staff and the city council deserve a lot of credit for what's in that plan. But I was also excited to read it because it is nearly identical to the climate action plan that the city of Ann Arbor has. And I've worked really closely with our staff on helping to implement that plan. And so I have a lot of hands-on experience with exactly the types of things that Evanston is trying to do. One thing I will say that's a big difference between the Ann Arbor plan and the Evanston plan is we don't have community choice aggregation in Michigan. Our utility is what's called a vertically integrated utility, which means that they not only distribute the power, but they supply the power, and they are able to do so through a state mandated monopoly. And so our utility is DTE. We have the pleasure of working with them. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But the community choice aggregation that Evanston has is a really powerful tool. And I think the council and the community deserve a lot of credit for pulling that tool out of the toolbox and for using it, because that is such an important part of achieving carbon neutrality. But when I read the plan, I'll get into talking about specific parts of the plan that I have experience with, but some other things that I would encourage the council and work with the staff to prioritize are that you really need to prioritize general fund dollars toward your carbon neutrality plan. The investments are massive, and it's very difficult to achieve this kind of a plan with other people's money and with grant funds. It's really hard to be competitive for that. You know, we're in an environment right now where there's tons of federal money available for infrastructure projects and for water, transportation infrastructure projects and for water projects, largely because there's bipartisan support in the federal government for those things. There isn't bipartisan support for carbon neutrality and sustainability. So there's not a whole lot of federal money available for it right now. So you're really looking at finding, philanthropic dollars and foundation dollars, and specifically prioritizing your general fund dollars toward those expenses. And so, it kind of goes back to the question about what would you do for the budget? You've got to free up money for your carbon neutrality plan. I think that something that's you can take advantage of federal dollars for right now is for energy efficiency and weatherization. There's actually a lot of federal money available for that through the Department of Energy, and those programs are can be targeted in ways in your community so that those investments are made more equitably, right? Because the houses that tend to be less energy efficient are also the houses that have tended to be occupied by families that have less financial means. And so it's really important to prioritize seeking federal dollars for weatherization and for energy efficiency and for electrification. And I'll talk specifically about something that we do in Ann Arbor, which is that we have a lot of families who want to participate in Ann Arbor's Solarize program, but they have knob and tube wiring in their house, or they have 100 amp electrical panels. And the cost of updating those types of, that type of infrastructure in people's homes is oftentimes out of reach for the families who live in those homes. So you can take advantage of federal dollars and to make those improvements in people's houses and bring them up to code, give them the 200 amp service that you would need to solarize your house. And then you can make solarize opportunities available for those families, which oftentimes you can utilize with zero money down, the way that these programs are structured. So it's really important to prioritize those types of equity initiatives through federal granting opportunities. Something that we've done in Ann Arbor that's been really successful is challenging regulatory rulings from our Public Services Commission. We challenge generation plans from our utilities. There's a big movement in Michigan to prioritize natural gas. That's not good enough, frankly. The planet will burn to a crisp by the time they're done with those natural gas plants. And so as the city of Ann Arbor, we've prioritized using our general fund dollars to challenge those rate cases and to challenge those generation plans in front of our Public Services Commission. And that's something that benefits the whole state. It's not just about what you're doing within your own organization. It's about what you're doing in your community and what you're doing in your state. We have also had a lot of success with hiring staff in our sustainability office who can essentially serve as community organizers, going out into neighborhoods and intentionally recruiting people for our solarized programs and for our electrification programs. And it has been really successful in Ann Arbor to do it that way. Organizing, neighborhood meetups in people's living rooms or in their backyards, and neighbors who are really interested in solarizing. We work with solar vendors, and they will come into a block and say, if you can get 10 other houses within a certain radius to do this with you, we'll give all you discounts, because it actually saves us money if we can just go from house to house to house to house. And so we have kind of taken an organizing approach to those programs. And again, that's something that isn't just about what the municipal organization is doing, but it's what you are doing in the community to further your carbon neutrality goals. And through that program, we've actually prevented annually 2,000 metric tons of carbon from being released into the environment. That's the equivalent of permanently removing 400 cars from our city roadways. And so that you really have to think creatively about getting outside of City Hall and getting into your community with those types of programs. So anyway, now let me talk about Evanston's carbon neutrality program. There is a focus on buildings, which is really important. Buildings are the number one, in a lot of communities, the number one contributor to carbon emissions. Sometimes the number one is transportation. And so I was really pleased to see a couple of really important things in the carbon neutrality plan, and buildings are a real challenge, right? And so things that I've talked about, being in the community and organizing people towards electrification and solarization and things like that, that's really important for converting your buildings over to alternative energy. But within City Hall, you also have to be solarizing and weatherizing your own city facilities and prioritizing general fund dollars toward that. That's something that we're using part of our ARPA funds for that. We're dedicating $4.5 million from our ARPA funds to solarize city facilities. Last year, we also were successful at getting a federal earmark to convert half of our affordable housing properties. Ann Arbor has a housing commission, and we own a whole slew of affordable housing properties, converting half of them to solar facilities. So we're going in and making electrical upgrades, weatherizing them, and putting solar panels on them with the goal of making them carbon neutral. So though, you have to prioritize those strategies in your general fund, be in the community working with homeowners and developers. Another strategy that's really important, you should be lobbying your state legislature to change the uniform building code so that new construction has to be electric and it has to have solar on it, right? There's an annex to the uniform building code that's specifically for energy efficient building, but most states haven't adopted it yet. And so that's something that the city of Evanston can be directing its lobbyists to implement. I was really pleased to see the city's fleet on there. I know the city has 400 vehicles in its fleet. In the city of Ann Arbor, we have 700 vehicles. We're a little more spread out than Evanston is. It's 125,000 people spread across 28 square miles, so we're less dense than Evanston is. But we've been really successful in Ann Arbor at greening up our fleet. And so our motor pool vehicles are now all Chevy Bolts. We have 4 DC fast chargers right at City Hall where they charge up. We are replacing our non-plowing public works and parks vehicles with F-150 Lightnings. We've convinced the police department to try out some Ford, what's the Mach-E, the Ford Mustangs in our detective bureau. And so, what we've done is taken our fleet rates in City Hall, subsidize them with general fund dollars so we can replace vehicles with electric vehicles. And, the ways that you finance that, I think, are really important. I know the plan talks specifically about streetlights. Really, the answer to streetlights is just invest the money in LED luminaires. There's no secret sauce to that. But I also want to talk a little bit about modal shift, which is getting people out of vehicles and taking advantage of multimodal transportation opportunities. Obviously, Evanston has great multimodal infrastructure with the L running through it. And it's an incredibly walkable community. But being in the community, something I notice is that the city can be making investments in pedestrian infrastructure and in pedestrian safety and in prioritizing really high quality bike infrastructure. And so those are things that, prioritizing that kind of modal shift and getting the community out of single occupant vehicles is really important to achieving your carbon neutrality goals. So that's a whole lot of detail. That was a very long-winded answer, but it's something I'm really passionate about and that I've done a lot of work on, and I'd be really eager to bring those experiences to the city of Evanston.
Thanks very much. Just want to give a quick time check. We're about 10 minutes before the end. We don't have a military hard stop, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There's a lot more questions that are prepared, so kind of leave to you the choice of how much, just how to handle the trade-off of depth versus breadth.
Sure.
Obviously trust your judgment on that. The next question is the following. The transition to online retail followed by the pandemic have been very hard for our local small businesses. What would be your strategy to attract and retain small businesses and to make our business districts vibrant and attractive?
Sure. So I think that what makes business districts and downtowns attractive for shoppers and for restaurant goers and for businesses is the same now as it was before. Walkable downtowns, high quality urban aesthetic, places where people want to spend their time, focus on multi-use development. These strategies that worked before the pandemic are still going to work now, right? And so I cross my fingers when I say this, but as we are coming out of the pandemic, doubling down on those strategies, I think, is really important. And you've seen a shift to more online retail. I think nationally, online constitutes 15% of retail sales, but you're also seeing a lot of retail outlets focus back on brick and mortar stores, right? Amazon is opening brick and mortar stores across the country, and people are realizing that the tactile experience of seeing a product and experiencing it before you buy it is still really important. So there are still opportunities, I think, to increase retail in your downtown. And so a couple things that I'll say about that is in Ann Arbor, we were able to protect our downtown from some of the most devastating impacts of the pandemic by opening our city streets up, closing them to vehicles, opening them up to pedestrians. And most of our major streets downtown from Thursday night through Sunday for almost the entirety of the pandemic were closed to vehicle traffic. And we allowed businesses, whether they're retail or bars and restaurants, to vend in the public right of way, not just on the sidewalk, but in the street, and to seat people for bar and restaurant service in those areas as well. So that required us to work with our Liquor Control Commission to amend our extension of premises permit. But we were able to do that. And that helped protect a lot of our businesses from the worst parts of the pandemic. Now there's still vacancy, businesses still closed. I don't want to say that it's all rosy in Ann Arbor, but we had a lot of success with that. And I think what that speaks to is the importance of cultivating quality urban environments in your downtown and in your neighborhood business districts. And so that's something that I would want to prioritize. Like I said about bike lanes, also, we built 50 miles of high quality bike lanes in the city of Ann Arbor recently. And that has helped to get people out of their cars, on their feet, walking through business districts and biking through business districts. And so driving that foot traffic to those storefronts is really the obligation of cities. And it's the obligation of businesses to get those people into the store and buying and selling. And so, I'll just mention in Pittsburgh, I worked on the reconstruction of Brookline Boulevard, which widened sidewalks and allowed for that same kind of outdoor vending and seating opportunities. And so that, those types of public investments lead to private investments. They lead to occupied storefronts. And the last thing I'll say is it'll be really important for me if I'm offered this job to get to know the business community, to meet with the downtown partnership and the chambers of commerce and hear from them what their needs are in these business districts, and do what I can to help direct city resources to improve the business environments in these downtowns.
Thank you very much. Affordable housing is a key priority for the city. How would you assess, integrate, and plan around affordable housing to ensure that we have tangible goals, accountability, and deadlines for action?
Sure. So there are a lot of strategies to achieving affordable housing, but affordable housing you don't move the needle on it without subsidy, right? And so you're always trying to find opportunities to partner with developers or to develop yourself to bring affordable housing. So let me talk about the couple different strategies, as I know that Evanston has an inclusionary zoning ordinance, and that's really important. And I know that the city invests energy in finding subsidy for private development, like low-income housing tax credits, so that new developments can have, expand on those opportunities and have affordable housing units within them. The problem with that type of affordable housing is that oftentimes those commitments for affordable housing expire. And so your strategy in those instances has to be intentionally working with those property owners to try and get them to extend their commitments to have those affordable units within their properties, and trying to find subsidy opportunities to extend those commitments. Because otherwise you kind of hit this plateau where, as new housing comes online, old housing drops off, and you kind of hit this plateau on the amount of affordable housing that you're stimulating in your community through those programs. And so that's really, really, really important. But I also think it's important for the city to be looking at its own properties and finding opportunities to develop affordable housing itself on its own properties. And when I say that, I want to acknowledge that that has to be done intentionally in conversation with communities and through a very intentional and inclusive zoning process. I live across the street from one of the largest affordable housing sites in the city of Ann Arbor. I love it. I think it's a neighborhood asset. It's an important part of the success of the business district we have in my part of Ann Arbor. And I think it has added to the quality of life that my wife and I have. And so those are things that neighborhoods should be considering when we're talking about developing city parcels for affordable housing. And so I think it's important to intentionally program staff toward those goals, making sure that you're keeping track of what units are coming off the affordable housing market, doing everything you can to keep them on the market, and then pursuing your affordable housing strategy on properties you own. I know we're running out of time. The last thing I'll say is that in Ann Arbor, our city council has directed us to develop 10 of our city properties into affordable housing properties. And that's something that I'm working on with staff through the development process. And I will say it's rewarding work. It's work that I enjoy. And I hope that I have the opportunity to do that in Evanston.
Thank you. I think we can squeeze in one more question, and then I'll offer you a quick opportunity for a close after that. But the last question, and I just want to apologize both for the kind of change in tone and the fact that we're going to end on this note, but it's a question that people posed with very good reason, unfortunately. You've probably read about the terrible misconduct that occurred among lakefront employees here in Evanston in recent years, as well as the report that included significant recommendations about next steps. What will be your strategy to implement these recommendations and to prevent similar behaviors from occurring in the future?
Sure. So I have read the report and I've read through the recommendations. And I'll just make a couple comments on that, is that every leader in City Hall, really every employee in City Hall, has a duty to report and investigate misconduct. And so individual employees shouldn't be investigating, but they should be reporting up until issues get the attention that they need for human resources, the city attorney's office, to carry out a proper investigation. There is no such thing as reporting a major violation of an HR policy, but telling your employer, but you know what, I don't want it investigated. That can't happen. We have a duty to report and a duty to investigate and a duty to take these issues seriously. I worked for 2 years as the interim HR director in the city of Ann Arbor. I have a lot of experience administering HR investigations, direct hands-on experience administering HR investigations. And what I can tell you is that it is critically important to protecting the culture in your organization, that people know that these issues will be taken seriously and will be investigated and handled seriously. And so, since we're short on time, I won't go through a laundry list of details here, but what I will say is that I agreed with the conclusion of the report. Given my background and my understanding of these issues, I would be making sure that this report is implemented. And through the example of my leadership and my own value setting with city staff, I will make it clear that everybody has a duty to report and that these issues will be handled by the book and in a timely manner according to the city's HR policies.
Great, thank you so much. With that, I just want to give you a quick opportunity to close, either by summing up or sharing anything that we didn't get a chance to address, either about yourself or about the city of Evanston. So go ahead if you want to take that opportunity.
Sure. I want to thank you, Mr. Mayor, and the City Council for naming me to be a finalist and giving me the opportunity to interview and to speak to your community members and to be in town at the end of the week this week. It means a lot to me. I hope that through this conversation, you and council members and community members can see the types of experiences that I would bring to this position and the depth of knowledge that I have, that I really do think that I can add value in Evanston. And at the end of the day, that's what gets me up in the morning. I have known, it's odd to say this, but I have known my whole life that I wanted a career in public service. And it's something that I cherish and something that I value. And the opportunity I think that exists in Evanston for us to do something really special together really excites me. And I hope that I get the opportunity to do it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. As I said at the beginning, the council is really excited about these two finalists, excited to get to know you a little bit so far and looking forward to getting to know you better, and very much appreciative of your time this evening. To the community, Luke Stowe, our interim deputy city manager, just put a link in the Zoom to a feedback form. If you're listening now, please go ahead and click on that and save that link. If you're watching this on YouTube later, whatever venue was utilized to make you aware of the YouTube link will also have a link to that survey. The survey questions were called directly from the outcome of the community engagement process that we did at the beginning of the search. So we're asking community members to evaluate the two candidates on the very subject matter areas or qualities and characteristics that the communities told us were most critical in the next city manager. And we, as John mentioned, John and Snapper will be in town for a series of in-person interviews at the end of this week. And council will be meeting on Monday evening. And so council will not be deliberating on this until Monday evening, which means that folks who are interested in weighing in, and I hope everyone does take the opportunity to weigh in, have until the end of the weekend to get your thoughts in and ensure that they will be taken into account by council and myself as we make our decisions. So I just want to close by thanking the really large number of community members, again, who participated both in generating questions for this forum and also in watching the forum tonight. Thank you in advance for sharing your input, which I know all 10 of us who ultimately have a vote on this are very eager to hear. And thanks so much, John, again, for your interest in this and your time and your engagement with these questions. We're looking forward to seeing you in a few days as well. And with that, wishing everybody a terrific rest of your Tuesday evening.